Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
It's my pleasure to share the stage with Professor Nick Warner, who I've gotten to meet, along with Dean Vrumsoni. Just been great to be in conversation with them for the past few weeks to figure out what the right thing is. I really admire Professor Warner. He wanted us to get together and think about the right language, so we're not talking past one another. We're not saying two different things, but it seems like it's the same way. My friends, you are at SC. Now, it's an amazing experience. You're in college. This is the time that you have the freedom to struggle with big questions. You know, more than any other time in the world, this is the time of the freedom to do this. You can ask big questions about truth. Is there an ultimate truth with a capital T? Is there a God? What is evil? What is real? And why are infinity scarves so popular? I mean, have you thought about that? Isn't it just a scarf with the ends tied together? I mean, whatever, all right? So today, we're here to talk about God, science, the nature of magic and reality. You know, but each one of us has our own perspective on what real is. You know, which concepts are authentic. Maybe what I think is real, you think is magical, and vice versa. How do we know what really is real? Well, let's look at something that I love, like the mathematical notion of reality. So right here, this is the Gauss-Bonnet theorem, right? Absolutely. Here it is. What it says is that if you take the integral of the curvature at every point on a manifold, if you add up how curvy it is at every point on a manifold, it's going to be 2 times pi times the Euler characteristic, which means that no matter how you deform the manifold and how all the little curvatures change, the total point of curvature, when you add it all up, is going to be the same. Amazing thing. Now, thank you. Now, while a handful of you are getting turned on by this, most of you might agree with Stephen Colbert when he says, equations are the devil's sentences. You know, so there's mathematical reality, right? But there's also physical reality. So here's Stephen Hawking, amazing physicist. Here's what he writes in his recent book. The universe does not have just a single existence or history, but rather every possible version of the universe exists simultaneously. So he has this notion of the multiverse. So here's my question. Are multiverses real? Are they magical? Is it physical realities, mathematical realities? You know, for thousands of years, the notion of truth and reality have been linked to the notion of a God. Now today in 21st century America, reality is no longer measured by the language of the church or holy days or God. You know, there's a belief that religion is no longer relevant. You can think of it like a scaffolding. It's just there to hold things in place while science fills it up with knowledge, and then you can kind of take the scaffolding off. This is best summarized by the work of Michio Kaku, another phenomenal physicist who's rephrasing Arthur C. Clarke's work. He says, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from divinity. Basically, in time, whatever God you have is just a placeholder. He'll be taken care of. Don't worry about it. Due to the Enlightenment mindset, science has become the new measurement of what is real. Black is the new white. Science is the new God. Let me step back a bit, all right, to sort of explain what I think has happened. You know, during the Renaissance era, art, music, math, literature, all of these worked together. Faith, reason, beauty, science were interconnected. These resulted in paintings and poems and cathedrals and inventions. And then the Enlightenment era followed around the 1750s. Now, what the Enlightenment era said is that science and reason must be advocated as the primary source of authority. Look, you just can't go around and say that the sun is in the center of the solar system just because you have faith in it. You must prove it, test it, evaluate it, tell me why it's true. I, as a mathematician, I'm a huge fan of the Enlightenment. It was a major force propelling our scientific progress and understanding. And it's given us what? Better transportation, better medicine, better ice cream. It's a great thing. But unfortunately, in the 21st century, I think it's been taken to an extreme. You see, we now try to explain everything away through science. Here's Bertrand Russell. Here's what he writes. Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. See, we're putting all our chips in the science bucket. Now, one major consequence is the notion of duality. So let me give you an example. In the Renaissance, you have this concept of art and math fitting together, the engineer and the artist working together. You can see this by the work of Da Vinci. Faith and reason working together. What do I mean by faith and what do I mean by reason? Faith is something you're putting your trust in that's not 100% guaranteed. And reason is the foundation on which you're trying to put the trust on. Religion and politics. Let me explain this for a second. Religion is the way you answer the big questions in life. Who are we? Why are we here? What is good? Morality. That's religion. Politics is how do you address the day-to-day things? And they're related. The way you answer your big questions is going to impact the way you think about the day-to-day life. And the supernatural and the natural, the things you can measure and the things you can't measure, they fit together. Well, now the Enlightenment comes, and it doesn't say it's one or the other. It's actually the one versus the other one. On one side, you have the art major, the kind, sensitive, loving person who's willing to paint and embrace life. And on the other side, the cold-hearted mathematician who, in their own way, are sexy. My friends, I don't want to sterilize this world. I don't want to cut the world up into two pieces. You see, I want to deal with messy things. I want to roll up my sleeves and get involved in the mess of this world, not to clean it up. I love messy things. Here are a couple of things that are messy that I absolutely love, right? Ice cream. This is not just ice cream. This is Grader's ice cream, right? You get this in Cincinnati and Columbus, Ohio. This is black raspberry chip. Huge chunks of chocolate chips that melt in your mouth because they're filled with fat. It's awesome. Here's something else that's messy that I love. Women. Dating, marriage, relationships, sex, messy things in this life. But we pursue it. Here's something else that's messy that I love. This is my family. Yeah, it sounds all cool, right? Let me just zoom in on a couple of details you might not want to get involved with. First of all, you'll notice that I'm an Indian kid, and my wife is Chinese. So if you think marriage is tough for two people who grew up in the same hometown, who have the same values, how hard is it for two people from two different cultures? It's a tough, messy marriage. My wife's biggest advice that she'll say is, always marry within your race. Yeah. Not so anymore, right? Yeah. And then you have those two things on the right and the one on the left, right? Their life is messed up, right? Because they have us as parents. What's their identity like? Do I want to sterilize and clean this up? And if you think that's tough, this little one, let me just zoom in here. Right? This is my baby girl, right? We adopted her. We did foster care. Now she's 2.5 years old, the light of my life, the dream. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, her life is gone. Why? Can you imagine her identity? But this messiness is absolute joy to me. This is not what I want to clean up. There's this junk we have called life that we love it. And what I want, here's what I want. I want a model. I want a theory. I want a story that can handle the beautiful mess. I am ambitious. I want a theory that can handle everything. I don't want a scientific theory. I want a theory at all. And all of us long for these bigger things. We long for justice, beauty, relationships, meaning, and significance. Why does Victoria's Secret not sell clothes using data charts, but beautiful, naked women? Because we love physical things. Why is it that we go to concerts and football games, fight on, right? We thirst for relationships with each other. We want to share that experience together. Why do we listen to Oprah and Deepak Chopra and mysticism and music? Because we want to have it has a hold on us. We thirst for something bigger than just who we are. Why does our hearts burn when we watch 12 Years a Slave or The Godfather? Because we want justice and retribution. See, we have a big, messy world, and we're dealing with issues larger in complexity than black holes, genetics, Gauss-Bonnet theorem. It's too big for science alone to handle, and throughout history, this is exactly what mankind has done. But they've turned to writers, musicians, artists, philosophers, theologians. They've tried to capture and express what's going on, the complicated and immensity of life. You see, science is just one of the languages. It's not the language. Now, everyone has a story. Everyone has a theory to explain this mess. Plato said, you know why things are messy, why things are broken? It's matter. The stuff is what's messy. The realm of the mind is pure. Marx has a reason. You know why it's messy? It's economics. That's what it is. Rousseau, the great French philosopher, who is one of the pushing foundation forces of the French Revolution, he says society, that's what's messy. Freud says your parents, that's why things are messy. Maybe the Enlightenment mindset says evolution. Things just happen by chance. You're going to have that mess while that happens. The Christian perspective says all of these things are true. Your parents are to blame. But the core issue behind all the issues is our separation from God. That's the foundation on which all of these cracks come from. To me, no story is as satisfying in explaining the world, all of it, all of the world, not just the measurable parts, better than the Christian story. For unlike any theory I know of, this faith boldly says that this mess is built into the very heart of God. That's why he's called Emmanuel, God with us in our mess and our pain and our joy. And this is seen in no greater clarity than in the life of Jesus, where his death on the cross is the climax of history, where evil was defeated when God came as man. And to me, the resurrection of Jesus, it's not a spiritual ghost who resurrected, but a person who resurrected in the flesh and the blood, says that this physical world matters. Flesh matters, ice cream matters, sex matters, earth matters, beauty matters. Our wonderful world will one day be set right. And this story is not theoretical. It's not a theoretical story. It's not a philosophical story. It's not a metaphysical story. It is grounded in the mess of history, making incredible historical claims, culminating in the resurrection of Jesus. And you can't use the tools of science on this, but you can bear on it the weapons of history. You can test to see if the claims hold. And I personally am convinced that they do. And finally, I have tested this theory in my life. As a scientist, you have a theory, you propose it, you practice it. And I've seen this in other lives around me. When I submit to this story, I do see more forgiveness. I do see more peace, more joy, contentment, and an understanding of how things work in this world to live life well. Let me just close with a quote from one of my favorite books, The Princess Bride. It says, "Life is pain. Anyone that says different is selling something." See, what I want to tell you is there are no easy answers. There's no one box, one Bible verse, one phrase that answers everything. Wrestle, my friends, wrestle with big questions, but don't be afraid to get messy. Thank you for your time.
I'd like to thank Joe Thackwell, Laura Ziesel, Satyan, Varun, and the Veritas Forum, and USC, of course, for allowing me to occupy the traditional role of the Christian, being thrown into an arena to be devoured by wild animals for the amusement of an audience. Before getting started, though, I would like to make a slight correction. If this thing, is it working? Yes. I much prefer to consider myself a militant humanist. The reason for this, well, manyfold, but one of which is that I like to think of what I'm for rather than what I'm against. I see also humans as these wonderful creatures who've understood an incredible amount over time and show great potential for developing further. I also see the cosmos, them living in a cosmos that is governed entirely by the laws of science, and in which I see really no room for anything to do with the supernatural. In addition, I'm a humanist because I believe, or I find it almost offensive, that when something good happens, God gets the credit, and the humans get the blame when anything bad happens. I think humans should be responsible for everything, the good, the bad, and getting credit where credit is due. Anyway, we'll get more onto that in a minute. Let's dissect the title of magical thinking a little bit. Now, there's a perfectly harmless idea in magical thinking, which is simply a lens by which you might look at or analyze what you see in terms of faith, myth, fiction, or the supernatural. However, I want to get down to what I think is the real problem for society, which is thinking in terms of faith, myth, and fiction, or the supernatural, when you should be using rational, evidence-based methodology. Or, putting it another way, insisting that the universe and everything in it, and everyone in it, conform to somebody's particular personal mythology. Now, that's very serious. One of my heroes has put it much more succinctly. Truthiness. Truthiness, the truth that comes from the gut, not books. The quality of preferring concepts and facts one wishes to be true rather than the concepts and facts that are known to be true. Now, Stephen Colbert is one of my heroes, but I'm glad to tell you the feeling is entirely mutual. That is indeed me. Okay, anyway. Now, the subtitle really is about, I think, what makes this conversation interesting is, in fact, how Satyan and I, with different intellectual backgrounds, come to very different worldviews. And so that's what I hope we'll talk about later on. But particularly, I think it's poignant because my background is, in fact, I spent 12 years in Anglican schools. I was raised in the Anglican church. I even sang in the choir until puberty destroyed my voice. And so I started out this kind of cute little kid. Wow. Right. Well, that's a good start. But over time, I evolved. And, well, the question is, how could such a nice Christian boy become something quite so diabolical? Well, my evolution is not that different from, I think, many, many scientists. It's not particularly special in that respect. I've been passionate about science since I was a kid. I always wanted to know how stuff worked. I got a chemistry set when I was 7, and it actually had stuff I could make explosives out of. Chemistry sets are sanitized now. It's really very sad. And like Satyan, I also love mathematics. And so physics, and particularly string theory, is where I now work, and it sort of marries that wonderful love of mathematics with the desire to understand how the universe works on the most fundamental level. So I just threw this in because this is what I currently work on. It's a title page from a talk I've given a few places around the world last year. But it's really what I do, is I use string theory to try and figure out what's happening in the bottoms of black holes. But the other thing I also do is teach general education astronomy. And that's a great pleasure to me because I get to meet a cross-section of the remarkable undergraduate body at USC. And so one of the things I do in this is I get to tell the story, a scientific story of how the universe evolved. This is one of the many slides I use to discuss this. But I also, in the process of telling the science story, I tell the human story, filled with passion and excitement and conflict, of how we ultimately came to throw off the supernatural and superstition and understand the origins of planets, stars, galaxies, and the universe itself. So I take the view that Genesis is beautiful literature, but the actual story of how the universe came to be is so much richer, and Genesis is such a pale shadow of what I think of as the real story. So, like many others before me, I tend to take the view that there is actually no need for the supernatural, and for God in particular, in understanding the physical universe. Now, it's important to understand that word "no need" to a scientist. You need to understand something of the culture of science. Science is about taking theories. You can't prove something is absolutely false or absolutely true in science. You can't prove God exists or doesn't exist. You can't prove the sun will rise tomorrow. What science is all about is evaluating theories and giving you some kind of probability of truth. But put bluntly, what will you bet on a theory? Will you bet $1, $1,000, a human life, or all of human existence? You know, the discussion of the theory of global climate change is all about discussing whether you'll bet the whole of human existence on that issue, and science's job is to try and give you an answer. So we do this by doing testing. And you start with ranking theories according to testing with experiments. And you start with a whole bunch of low probability hypotheses, and some of them get falsified, and at the end of the day, you wind up with things which you are absolutely so nearly certain of that you call them laws of nature. They are simply extremely high probability hypotheses, and there are low probability hypotheses that you've essentially discarded. Then rationality enters the picture. The only rational course, once you've assigned probabilities to theories, is to live your life as if extremely low probability things are false and things that are extremely high probability are true. Like, for example, it's not inconceivable that I could be kidnapped by fairies when I go home tonight, or that a tiger could eat me in my backyard. It is simply a low probability hypothesis. And so I take the view that explanations of the universe based on any kind of supernatural phenomena, I can't prove they're false, but I can say they are so low probability that the only rational thing to do is assume they're false. That's, I think, a fairly typical attitude of scientists. Going the other way, God gets pretty short shrift from the Franciscan monks. William of Ockham, 13th century Franciscan monk, these are statements attributed to him. But today, his statements have come to be subsumed under the idea of Occam's razor, which simply says, given two theories that fit the same observational data with the same predictive power, choose the simplest one. So as a scientist, you come up with a theory, and perhaps it involves God. But the introduction of God adds neither value, nor predictive power, nor explanatory power to any theory. So then, basically, the only thing you can really do is to simply assert that God adds an incredibly unnecessary complexity to any scientific theory, and therefore basically chuck it out of the theory. The theory works just as well without it, so why add the complication? Okay. However, this piece of William Blake is an incredibly beautiful piece of art and is a testament to what the human mind can do when inspired by thoughts of God. For me, the corresponding image is this. This is Omega Centauri. I first saw this the first time when I was 13 through a telescope I'd helped build, and the picture of it went to my soul. It was the most beautiful thing. The image I had was completely crummy compared to this. This is some beautiful thing by the European Southern Observatory. But the image I saw just spoke to my heart so deeply. And the reason why is I'd built the telescope. Moreover, the telescope was capturing photons from that object that left it 16,000 years ago, and it was collecting them and entering them into my eye. It wasn't some miserable reflection of photons from a computer screen. It was stuff that came from the thing itself. I loved it for that. I treasured it for that. And the reason why is essentially irrational. It's part of the awe and the beauty of the thing that just makes the whole thing so worthwhile. So this kind of idea that essentially the awe and the wonder that you get from just simple things like looking through a telescope really is what feeds my drive to do research, what makes me really want to continue doing research, how I see a deep beauty in the subtle layers of theoretical physics. As a child, I was also inspired by lots and lots of stories. Jules Verne, all the way through to Philip K. Dick, Sherlock Holmes, Doctor Who. I wanted to be, I'm not joking, I wanted to be all these people. I wanted to be Sherlock Holmes. I wanted to build a warp drive. I wanted to own a time machine. All of this was my magical thinking. I assimilated these role models, and they in turn shaped who I became. So the other side of this is that a complete human experience of the universe must involve role models, hopes, dreams, love, passion, compassion, empathy, all that mess that Satyan was talking about. Mentors and gods often also give our individual lives meaning, and all of this must be treasured and honored as such. I would really find a completely rational life utterly depressing. What makes people interesting are all those messy details, all that rich internal life. And so, really, I think there are two fundamental imperatives, at least of my life and probably I think it more generally. For me, there's the rational, empirical study of the universe and nature and understanding how it all works. But then there's the other side of this, which is living a full life as a human being and enjoying everything the universe has to offer, all the mess. Then, the real issue is to find the balance of those and integrate it together, because if you cut the imperative of understanding both aspects of your life, you're going to cut your soul in half. So, I agree deeply with what Satyan had to say. I even was kind enough to share that slide with me before coming here, because we discussed it. That slide, I think, is indeed a dualism that we all face, but I think he's mischaracterized the origins of it. First of all, I had to get rid of the supernatural. That's me. Right. Dualism. What's the dualism I really think it is? It's really empiricism, that which we use to understand the universe, versus humanity. There's the empirical universe, and then there's the human experience of the universe. And I'd reorganize all those things Satyan was talking about under these different headings. Basically science, math, and reason against art and music. But it's really not about Renaissance and Enlightenment values, it's about humanity and empiricism. And things like politics, ethics, psychology lie in this really difficult intermediate ground where you try and rationalize or reconcile the two. So I think really every human is kind of on a quest to find a balance between the human experience of the universe and a rational understanding of it. Why the Sherlock Holmes stories are so wonderful and so enduring is the rationality of Holmes is balanced against the deep humanity of Watson. And so in a sense, we all individually have to realize that within ourselves and understand and find that balance. Our task is really finding that balance, and it is, I think, the sole responsibility of us individually as people, as humans. Going further, I'd say that I think faith can help, but can just as easily hinder that problem. Because sometimes, just like in science, a belief in the supernatural is a complexity that really doesn't help understanding it. It's in being introduced where it's not needed. So my quest really has taken me from essentially Omega Centauri to understanding black holes and what's happening in the bottom of black holes. I've become a militant humanist for many reasons, but one of them is I know from my own experience that the human mind can go to the edges of the universe, from the Big Bang to the bottoms of black holes, and conceive of incredible possibility. Conversely, I find closed-ended arguments that one often encounters in religion, like the ineffability of God, to be antithetical to the human spirit, and sometimes the refuge of charlatans. It is imperative we avoid the dark side of magical thinking, where we require the universe to conform to our particular cultural prejudice or our own personal mythology. Once again, I can only go to humorists. They seem to say a great deal of wisdom. This one's Douglas Adams. The dark side of magical thinking. The universe is an unsettlingly big place, a fact which, for the sake of a quiet life, most people tend to ignore. Many would happily move to somewhere rather smaller of their own devising, and this is in fact what most people do. So Douglas Adams unfortunately died quite a few years ago, but I think this encapsulates my concern about magical thinking. And rather than finish on such a glum note, let me try and turn it around and say, look, from my perspective, rationality in the human mind can shed incredible light in the darkness, and have done. But equally important is the unfettered, unprejudiced, and unimpeded journey of the soul as we gain that enlightenment. And achieving a balance is the common challenge that the atheists and people of faith all face, and for which I think there are many good solutions, not just one. I'll finish there.
Satyan, I'm going to start with you, just because Nicholas had a chance to react to your presentation. I'm wondering if you would be so kind as maybe just to share a few observations about what Nicholas has just presented to us.
Absolutely. This is good? Great. I just wanted to say just two things. I mean, there are so many things to talk about, but two things that sort of caught my attention was, when you said these words, I hope I'm right, but you said God doesn't add complexity to the scientific theory. Does adds, right? It does. And I agree with you 100%. So when it comes to scientific theory, if I want to talk about Gauss-Bonnet, I don't really need Jesus in the house, right? I mean, that's not the point. When I'm talking about polyhedra, moduli spaces, when we're looking at the black holes, I don't need a notion of God to make sense of it. But to me, it's not the scientific theory that I thirst for God, that's what, as humanity, we thirst for, but the other parts of life, sort of what I call the mess of life. So I do agree about the scientific part. So that's just one comment. And I'll just say another one, and then you could. Is that okay? Okay. And then the second one is when you said, I guess this is my thing. You said somehow that science measures, this rationalistic way, measures reality. But to me, I don't know why one would say that art equally doesn't measure reality. Or as a musician, maybe as a musician, you're saying, you know what? You can say all you want about science, but music, that is what captures reality to me. Why should we bias ourselves into saying that science, I mean, as a scientist, of course I'm biased, right? So without a doubt, I mean, so so as a scientist, I am biased. As a mathematician, I'm even more biased to measure reality that way. But I've had conversations with artists and musicians and actors who say, that's not how I view reality. Something else moves me. When you saw that, as a kid in a telescope, and you say, wow, the scientific perspective of those photons hitting my eyes, that's sexy. And for somebody else, they might say, that's not sexy at all, dude, that's creepy, right? They might say, but this Monet, like, that's what touches me. So those are the two pieces of tension that I really caught.
So I'm taking the second one first because I can remember it. I think art really is all about the human reaction to it, the life that you have inside you. I mean, if you look at a piece of art, you can dissect the color palette in terms of the photons emitted, the photons reflected. That's not what the art is for. The art is to speak to the soul. Now, I'm using that term in the sense of speaking to the human person that you are. And the better the artist, the more magical that experience is. I chose Omega Centauri simply because it's something that spoke to me very, very deeply. But when I first put this talk together, I actually had a painting from the National Gallery. But it was just a beautiful piece of art that speaks to me as a human being. So when I talk about measuring the universe, I talk about the cold-hearted, evil scientists who just measure stuff on meters. When I go out in the world and try and measure what's going on, I've got to be able to reproduce it. I've got to be able to tell my colleagues about it. But when it comes to art or music, it's about what happens inside the person and how it speaks to that person. That's the magic of the. So what was the first point? Oh yeah, sorry. The first point. You finessed something there. You talked about mathematics. I'm talking about physics. Now there's a difference between physics and mathematics.
Wow.
We not only have a humanist and a Christian, but I think maybe even more importantly, a mathematician and a physicist. So there are all sorts of...
The point is, in physics, your job is to go out into the world and measure the universe and all the mess there is and try and figure out what's going on. Whereas in mathematics, it's a self-consistent structure, which you just deduce logically. Physics is all about figuring out what's going on in the universe. So I tend to separate that completely off from the human experience of that. But it's very important to understand what physics is trying to do. It's trying to model everything in the universe or in nature.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, so to me, it feels like that in some sense, that's your religion. I mean, maybe I'm saying it the wrong way, but you're saying that the measurable things are more important or should be more valued on a scale than feelings.
No, I said equally important. Remember at the end? There's two facets. Look, when you live your life, I love figuring out how the universe works, what happens at the bottom of black holes, how the quantum structure of space-time works. That's when my brain really gets going. But I also love my wife. I love my children. I love art. I love going out in solitude. That's the human experience, and both are important, and you have to find the balance. Everybody has to find the balance between them.
So obviously you're both very passionate. You've thought about these issues a great deal. And I'll ask the same question to both of you in a different way. Satyan, for you as a Christian, what frustrates you most about what atheists think about your beliefs or ascribe to you? And vice versa, as a humanist, what frustrates you about what perhaps religious people ascribe to you or project onto you?
I guess frustration is a wrong word because atheist is a big word, right? I mean, there's a whole group of atheists who think different things, just like there are a whole group of Christians. So, but let me just say one thing that if people can sort of take me seriously, the one encouragement I would give is the following thing, which is try to not read Scripture, what we call Scripture, the Old Testament, the New Testament, or even the Old Testament. That's great with me. Try not to read that through the eyes of a 21st century being, through the eyes of a scientist. And I say that because, Professor Warner, Nick, you just said, you were saying that Genesis, somehow when you read Genesis, it pales in comparison to the beauty of what has really happened. Absolutely. And I read a couple of chapters of some English words. How can that compare to the beauty of right? And that's absolutely true. But yet, if we say, the goal of Genesis is to capture the beauty of creation, then you're absolutely right. But that's not the goal of Genesis to me. It had a purpose on why that was written. In fact, Genesis 2 is quite contradictory to Genesis 1. Mm-hmm. So why are those things written? And so I encourage you, as books of narrative, as books of literature, just pursue that and try to read it the way it was meant to be written, rather than through the eyes of a scientist or an analyst or a 21st century person. That's my encouragement.
I'd say you read it as both. I mean, but responding to the question you asked, I think the thing that I find perhaps most frustrating or difficult about being an atheist when I talk to Christians is the assumption that because I'm godless, I don't have any morals. You know, the Ten Commandments is not a really good basis for morality. We can argue that later. But the fact that an atheist has rejected the teachings of the Bible and essentially or rejected God or whatever, there are many, many moral and ethical codes out there. Moreover, we've had millions of years turning us into social animals. And in particular, we are very skilled at looking at all the possible ethical options open to us, and we choose carefully. We do. I think every Christian, and I bet you there's very few in here that haven't, don't cherry pick the Bible for their morality. I hope you don't stone people for picking up sticks on Sunday. But, you know, Old Testament's too easy to shoot at. But more seriously, as an atheist, I have thought very deeply about the ethics I've chosen, I adopt, I follow. And I think every atheist, because we're such a reviled minority, I've actually been very careful about looking at their religion and all the possible religions and their ethical origins. And to assume that because I'm godless means I'm immoral, I think is the thing that bothers me the most.
Satyan, as a mathematician, are there principles that you have come across, mathematical principles, that you also see as perhaps spiritual principles? And I think about, you know, in physics, Newton's third law, action, reaction. To me, that's very similar to the Hindu idea of karma, or to the Christian idea of you shall reap what you sow. Are there things, do you find God in math as a mathematician? If so, how?
So, first of all, I'm not that smart. So I just want to start by saying that I haven't deeply thought about, like, in some sense, a philosophical thing. But I think, especially in a subject like math, I think it's very much a sense of perspective. So to me, when I'm doing the Gauss-Bonnet theorem, when I do my research on origami or genetics or whatever it may be, I love the research for what it is. I love mathematics for what it is, a language that measures structure. It might not relate to reality at all. It could just be a self-contained language. And I find it absolutely beautiful. Now, as a Christian, I could come along and say, wow, look what the Lord of the universe has made, and look how I'm able to measure this. But I feel like you don't have to be a Christian at all to appreciate it. In fact, when I teach my classes, I'm not there to preach the message, you must become a Christian to see this better. I just want to say, look at this amazing thing. And if you're a Christian, you could just add that on. And if you're not a Christian, that's fine. So math itself inherently, I think, is a beautiful study of structure. But the need for God to do it is not there. That's not why I'm a Christian at all.
Let me add, though, I don't think subtracting God from that equation, certainly for me, it doesn't reduce the emotional value and experience. The thing with with Omega Centauri and these other images, there is a passion and a joy that I think both Satyan and I feel when we do our research. And for me, God simply doesn't enter into it. It's just the joy of being a human, trying to figure out a very complex pattern that fits in the very small amounts of data that I have to try and figure out what's going on. And when you get that piece to fit, when you finally figure it out, you're the first person who's done that. That's magic.
So, Nicholas, you talk about magical thinking. In some ways, the religious texts, I think, for you, rely upon this notion of magical thinking. But you also talk about magic as being something real. And I know from our conversations that you spend a lot of time in the desert and that you're moved by and you're in awe of what you see. It sounds like to me when you're going to the desert, you're having what I would consider a mystical experience. So within your concept of the way you see the world, is there room for maybe a different conception of God? Maybe not a Christian God, but one that is compatible with your scientific belief, that is transcendent, that is perhaps a type of super consciousness or something else that that would allow you then to have what might be a moment of awe or a feeling of, you know.
I want to separate out. I certainly have mystical moments of awe when I'm out in the desert or understanding stuff, but that's something that's entirely happening inside me. It is, you know, I'm sure one of my colleagues 20 years from now will tell me exactly what neurotransmitters are producing that. But that doesn't reduce from the magic of experiencing the thing. It's like when you go to a play. You go to a play and you invest completely in the characters and the dialogue, even though that play is being done 1,000 times with different people, because you are utterly invested in the moment as a human being. And then when you leave, ah, that's how that actor did it. Oh, you see the mechanism. But knowing the mechanism doesn't remove the joy of the experience. The joy of the experience is there. And I don't think God is in any way involved in that process for me. It's entirely inside me. It's entirely inside, I believe it's entirely inside the neurochemistry of everybody. That doesn't mean that because there's a puppet master in form of the chemistry, it isn't wonderful and mystical and joyous. But no, if there was a God, you know, I would be able to measure him, and if I could measure him, I'd formulate a theory and test it.
I'm going to ask each panelist one more question, then we'll open it up for Q&A. And so, Satyan, you had a critique of this sort of post-Enlightenment dualism that manifests in a university context where many professors are hyper-specialists in their field. And we try to push our students towards interdisciplinarity, but in fact, they're being taught in one domain in life as opposed to in all domains. And so the university becomes a multiversity as opposed to a university. What advice do you have for our university students to have that university experience, a unifying, holistic, integrative experience that perhaps brings together the spiritual and the scholarly in their life?
Wow, I love that question.
Glad you're going first.
Yeah, I love that question. That is actually a very passionate question for me. Let me just think about the right way to start. I think college and the university experience you're there for the long play. So if you're parents in the room, just don't listen to me for a little bit, all right? What that means is a lot of parents say, look, you want to be a philosophy major? What job can you get out of it? You want to be an artist? How can you work with that thing? You feel like you're going to college to get a degree in order to get a job. That's not my perspective of what you go to college for. To me, you go to college to learn about the big ideas. As a high school kid, you know nothing. And as a college kid, you know just a little bit more than a high school kid. So as a high school kid, you know, you're 16, you're 18, you really know you want to be an engineer? Really? I mean, have you thought about it? You've taken sociology classes to know that's not it. You've taken art classes to know that that's not it. You know that ever since you were 2, you want to be an engineer. There are some people who are like that, right? Professor Warner, maybe as a physicist, as a kid building that telescope, he knew it. But I think 95% of the kids in the world don't know it. So my encouragement is, fall in love with the major, pursue that one major with your heart, but take as many courses in everything as you can. Now, in the long run, that will reap dividends in your life. But in the short run, you might not get the dream job right out of the bat. But when you're 30, you're having a glass of wine. When you're 45, you're having colleagues in your accounting firm. You can talk about Dante. You can talk about big questions that those guys have never seen. So I think that's one way to actually honor the different fields and not just plow and be specialized in one thing.
I'm going to ask one last question, Nicholas, and then we'll open it up. I ask for anyone who wants to ask a question, please text it to this number here, and we'll get the questions down on the stage. Nicholas, this is Career Week for us here at USC, Career Fest, and so many students of this generation, I call them the post-Thriller generation because they were born after the release of Michael Jackson's album Thriller, and that was like the seminal moment in my life, but other people call them the millennials. You know, for me, it's life before and after Thriller. Anyway, this generation is really the first in American history to think about how they want to find meaning and purpose, not just in their life as individuals, but in their life as professionals. They want to connect the personal and the professional. They want to find meaning and purpose in their career. You obviously have a great deal of passion for physics. It seems to me that you've picked the right career. You've made the right career choices for who you are authentically. What advice do you give to our students who are thinking about their career trajectories in terms of finding their passion? How do they know what they want to do? And maybe you could share how you might have got to where you're at now.
I guess actually my older daughter is probably a good example of exactly one of these things where she was very good at all forms of science, but I remember having a conversation saying with her, I think along the lines with Satyan's remark, which is, in the human mind is an incredibly brilliant thing, because from partial data, you can take that partial data and you can fill in a world of possibility that fits into that partial data. And any scientist, any creative person, I think, is taking partial data and then trying to fill in the whole picture and then look at that picture. This is what we sometimes call intuition. It's kind of when you know the answer before you've even sat down to really calculate, or however you express that finding of the answer. Part of the task of being an undergraduate, and part of I think, the task of life is to learn where your intuition is. Learn when you kind of know the answer before you've even thought about it. That's where your skill is best, where you will be happiest. It's much better to work on the things where you will do the greatest things that are most satisfying to you if you're doing the things you're best adapted to doing. And the art of being an undergraduate is, and perhaps even a graduate student, is to find that thing, search it out. And so my daughter, I remember on the phone, she's saying, but when I do organic chemistry, I kind of know how the molecules fit together before I even thought about it. Right, well, didn't come from me, but the broader point is, that's the thing. That's the moment that you found the thing, and then you follow it. You know, there are going to be lots of forces on you to make more money, or when you become when I graduated as a graduate student, I had an offer from the military industrial complex at 3 times my salary, and I had to think really hard about not taking that job. It's a very difficult choice, but at the end of the day, you will be happiest if you follow your muse, you follow your intuition. And, you know, for this audience, I can say, it's better to be crucified for what you believe in.
Nice, very nice. So let's go to the questions that you've asked, and here's one for both Nick and Satyan. Nick, I'll start with you. Have you ever come close to believing in God, say post-Anglican education? And Satyan, the inverse. Has your faith been challenged, and have you ever thought to yourself, God has no place in my life?
I could start first, and then because you just spoke, is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Every year, several times a year, I would wake up and go, am I kidding myself? Am I putting all my chips in a basket about a guy who died 2,000 years ago, and these old texts, and that's somehow the truth of everything? And I absolutely question that. So I don't ever have this rock solid faith that lasts all the time. But to me, the thing that pulls me away from that question over time and comes back to putting my trust in God, or the story of the Christian faith, I think the best analogy I can give is my wife and I. If you put her hand in mine, I've been married to her for 17 years. If you put her hand in mine 17 years ago, blindfolded me and say, is that your wife's hand or some other girl's hand? I might not get that right. But I have held her hand for 17 years. And if you put her hand in mine now, I'll get it right. And over these years, I have gotten to know her. And so when my trust in God is shaky, which it certainly does several times, intense tragedies, intense pain, and even intense reality sometimes, and say, is the physical thing real? I come back and I say, but I have walked with him. I have felt his presence over these years, and he is more real to me than her hand is. And I can measure those things.
I think, sorry to rain on the parade a little bit, but no, but in fact, no. I mean, there have been transcendent moments, mystical moments where I've understood something, I've figured something out, I've made a new discovery, and that just goes, you see me using the words of Christianity, goes to my soul, goes to my heart, it fills me with awe. I'm co-opting those words because this is something inside me. I've never seen the need for, or never had a sense of something outside. I've certainly had wonderful mystical experiences, but I know that's my biochemistry. In fact, my evolution has been somewhat the opposite. It's been, I was raised in the Christian church. I treasure the cultural heritage, by the way, and I've read copious amounts of the Bible. So it's part of who I am, the Christianity. But it's been slowly casting off bits and pieces of it. I'll tell you one little anecdote. I mean, the final casting off was due to the Mormons. So I decided I'm going to go to the Mormon tabernacle and with my wife, and we decided we're going to have a tour. And I'm thinking, I'm kind of in an argumentative mood today. Let's have at it. And we get this tour, and it's wonderful. And we get shown these dioramas of Joseph Smith and the spectacles and all. It's amazing. And I remember going, what am I going to shoot at? There's so much stuff. And then I kind of left, and I was kind of nice, and I decided, okay, I'll be nice. But afterwards I thought, the only difference between the Mormon religion and my religion, my old religion, is the old religion's 2,000 years old. It's the same pile of stuff So the fact that I reject the Mormon religion, taking the biblical thing, I decided to take the beam out of my eye before I started picking the mote out of somebody else's. And so that was a casting off for me, like, oh yeah, I've been taught all this stuff that clearly doesn't make any sense.
Well, Satyan, how do you explain consciousness from a theistic Christian perspective? And Nicholas, without God, where does consciousness come from?
How do I explain it from a Christian theistic perspective, right?
Or even just from your perspective as a Christian.
Yeah. I think, the sense, these beautiful things that Nick is describing about himself, the joy of finding beauty, whether in the desert or in doing physics, right, is, I think, because we are created in God's image, in the sense that this consciousness, this breathing of God, is the creativeness that we have is partly because of the creativeness that he's given us, because he is creative. So this consciousness, to me, the way I would define it, is that he's made us different than just the stuff of the earth. We are more than just the molecules. And I think the point of Genesis 1 is that there's this inherent difference between us. That's the way I think of it.
No, it's a very difficult question to answer where consciousness comes from. I'm hoping some point along the line neuroscience will give us some kind of answer. I don't think there's anything intrinsic, anything outside that causes me to be conscious. I think it's a natural result of assembling a certain collection of molecules in my brain. I have that experience, and I will get an explanation probably in the next 100 years of what causes me to feel conscious. But in the meantime, I'm going to enjoy the hell out of it. But going back to something I just want to follow up on what you were saying. You say God makes you creative, or that because he's creative, God was made in an image. These are things that kind of bother me because, first of all, we're creative because we've had millions of years of evolution to become creative. If we weren't, we'd have been eaten by the tigers or something. However, in addition, when you say something like God made us in an image, there's probably out there, a very high probability hypothesis that there's some semiconductor life form that lives on an outer planet in another solar system that's that big and is made out of ceramics. Is that made in God's image? No.
Could you say that last part?
If I had a life form which was
yes.
self-aware,
oh, interesting,
and it was ceramic and it was superconducting, it lived on an outer planet, in what sense is that made in God's image?
That's a brilliant question. I have no idea. So to me, the sort of the Christian Orthodox perspective is, the scriptures and the Christian perspective is the intersection of God with us on this earth. And so if there is another life form out there, I cannot read the mind of God, nor even put myself in that shoes. All I know is how God has played a role here.
You just played the ineffability card.
There are a lot of cards I have, and but that's I can't read the mind of God to say that we're the only creatures, nor am I.
No, but I'm literalist. You said made in his image.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So a bit of ceramic on the floor.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me back up. For me, when I say made, I don't mean God physically, like molding Lego pieces, made. I meant that as created beings, when I say created, I don't mean this instantaneous creation. It could be over millions of years, right? But that concept of God breathing life into us, that there is a separation between us and earth, that God has actually breathed stuff into us to give us this consciousness. And when I say created beings, maybe I'm using too much of a Christian lingo, but I mean that we are stewards, we are reflections of his character. The reason we long for justice is because he does. The reason we adore the beauty of this world is because he does. We are made in his image, and that's what I mean by that.
You don't think the desire for justice, the desire for those sorts of things is an evolutionary trend because it's a good advantage for a social animal to have those traits?
And just because it's a good advantage for those social animal to have those trends doesn't mean that's the only way that happened. So I'm not disagreeing you.
I know, but I'm trying to push you into the corner of a low probability hypothesis.
So could you say that one more time then?
So I came up with a natural explanation of some of the things you said, for example, creativity or the desire for social justice along the lines of evolution and evolutionary mechanisms. And I have an explanation of that that's simple and doesn't involve God. Therefore, by the usual tenets of science, I chuck God out of that theory and say, here's the theory that works.
Can I just ask you one thing? What about the fact that we have an intense longing for most of us through history for something bigger than we are. In fact, most people would claim to be religious in some sense, that they have longed for God.
But I'd say that's exactly what drives my research. I have an intense longing to understand the biggest thing out there. It's the universe as a whole. We all have that desire, and it expresses itself in different ways as we get more and more culturally sophisticated. I think religion, as it started, was in some sense a proto-science. It was, I want to figure out why the sky looks like that. I want to figure out why the ground looks like that, why people want to club me to death occasionally, and this sort of thing. I want to figure that out. And then you invent prayer, and you invent rituals and ceremonies. That's proto-technology. That's the attempt to influence outcomes based on the model of science you've made, religion, to create new things happening. So religion, prayer, ritual, I think is just proto-technology. And as we get more sophisticated, we understand more of the story of the universe, the story gets better.
So you're saying that the reason that humanity as a whole for centuries has a longing for God, for something bigger, for supernatural, is because of evolution. In other words, it's wired us that way to long for something bigger.
We are definitely wired that way.
But yet we can't trust that wiring, right?
No. When we get more data, that wiring gives us a better and more accurate picture of the nature.
But then why should I trust the data of believing in evolution?
Because we have huge numbers of experimental tests. It's an incredibly high probability hypothesis. And a good example is, Darwin produced the theory of evolution based on studying natural selection in animals. We now have staggering amounts of data based on sequencing the human genome that confirms every aspect of Darwin's theory. We have absolutely staggering amounts of data that support
I'll
that
just
theory.
say one thing, but so to me, I have staggering amounts of data that there is a God to a certain degree because so many people long for him. I mean, you could use that same argument to say that there's a thirst for something bigger, and there is all these data points. Or if you say, well, you can't believe that data point because evolution can trick you, then you can't believe the data that evolutionary theory is going to be right, because that itself could be tricking you.
I agree there's a thirst for something bigger, but I think as you gather more data and as a culture becomes more sophisticated, the answers to those questions and the resolution of that thirst become much richer. That was why I put Genesis up against the modern understanding of how the universe came to be. There is a thirst to understand where we came from, who we are, how we're placed in the universe. Frankly, it can be a bit damn scary, but the point is that we now know so much more that those original attempts have become wonderful parts of our culture, literature. They were created by some of the greatest minds 2,000 years ago, but we know a heck of a lot more now than we did then. So let's replace those stories by the stories that we now know and have data to support.
So we're coming to near the end of our time, but I do want to get back to the questions from the students. And Satyan, you talked about this longing for God, that it's historical, that it's universal, that, and even Nick, you said we're hardwired for it, that we see it across time and space. Satyan, if there is this, going to this yearning for God that is universal, that is kind of hardwired into what it means to be human, is Jesus, for you, the only way then to get to God? Or is it for everyone, or do you believe that Jesus is a way for you to get to God, but other people could have other prophets or avatars or paths to get to the same place?
That's a great question. To me, I think of it as a theory, a model, a story. Those are all interchangeable words in my mind. So if somebody comes to me and says, I believe in physics, I believe what it says, and I believe in quantum mechanics, all of those ideas, but this whole thing of gravity just gets me down. It just...
Literally, right?
That wasn't a joke, it just happened. The gift is just there. It just gets me down, and I really want the freedom to fly, and it just restricts my life, right? Why should I believe in that notion of gravity when it restricts my life? And a physicist would say, look, you're kidding me. That is an inherent part of the story of physics. You can't just say, this is the way electricity and magnetism works, but the gravity part, you can't just have the freedom to do this. So to me, when I talk about the Christian story, I believe it as the truth with a capital T as much as I believe in physics with a capital P. So in other words, I believe that is the story of reality, that there is a God who is unique, and he has intersected the world this way. And he has given us the truth through his Son. So I don't think it's a personal thing, just like I don't think physics and your belief in gravity is a personal thing. You can believe what you want, but gravity's there. And just like you can believe what you want, but I think God really did do these things through history.
Nick, I'm going to ask you a question. Yes, sure.
Make me comment. I mean, I agree, gravity is not an option. You know, actually, as a physicist, I'd say that if you don't believe in gravity, you'll be naturally selected against. But more seriously, you're putting things that you can test and verify, like gravity, against something which is not reproducible and not.
Yeah, I'm not putting this on the par at all with physics. All I'm doing is making an analogy of what I think would be truth. So I wasn't saying that the measurement and the truth and reality of the existence and what we claim in the Bible to be true is the same way you measure physics. Not at all. They're at a different world, whole different level of messiness, different tool sets are needed. So that's not what, I'm just using an analogy, that's all.
Nicholas, let me just ask you this question. You said that your passion is to discover how the universe works. Is there some kind of underlying order, some kind of unifying theory or concept that Satyan was talking about? His attraction, his embracement of a Christian theological perspective is to provide a singular unifying theory for everything. Have you found something in your work that is
string theory? No, but finish the question. I mean,
that's the question.
I mean, what I do is basically trying to find a theory which is computable, reproducible, fulfills all the goals of science that describes, all the fundamental structure of nature. So, indeed, but it might as well be asking for God or some unifying being in there. I can't measure that being. I can't even formulate a theory. I can't do the math because it's just an unneeded complexity. I hope and believe that string theory or some version of it will actually describe the universe and how it evolved. And I don't see any need for anything supernatural of any form in that explanation.
Last question. I'll ask it to both of you. It's the question of free will. If there is a God, like you have articulated, the God that you believe in, do we have free will? And how does that work within a theological perspective? And Nicholas, for you, do we have free will? Or are we just the product of our genetic makeup and our environmental conditions? Is there something beyond nature and nurture that gives us some kind of agency?
Let's start by saying that absolutely I believe in free will. In fact, the whole understanding of how a good, powerful God can allow pain and injustice and brutality in this world to occur is because of free will. If you say, well, how can he allow something like that to happen? He should intervene. Then you can say, well, how can he allow somebody to cut me off on the road? He should intervene. And eventually, if he's intervening in everything that there's wrong, then we have no choice but to do only what he thinks is right. So the fact that we have the freedom to do and go against what he thinks is right, what is considered good and just, that is the definition of free will. We choose to do wrong things. So I think it's built into what I believe to be true.
It's one of those really difficult philosophical questions. If you're a physicist, you'd say, okay, there's an initial state of my brain, and there's an evolution that's occurred, and that should be deterministic. There must be some mechanism in there, because I believe in free will, but I'm also a realist enough to know that that could be an illusion. It's a very difficult philosophical problem. I personally believe there's free will. How the mechanism of that works inside my brain when I choose to do one thing or choose to do another, I don't know. But I certainly believe I have those choices, and I have a choice to do good things and bad things, and my preconditioning, my morality, and everything else makes me make those choices, and sometimes I get it wrong. There is a free will, but there's no external agency involved in that process. It's all happening in my head.
So before we end tonight, I just want to give you each an opportunity to offer some final thoughts, reflections, observations. Satyan, I want you to have the last word tonight. So Nick, why don't you, well, start with you. Just some final thoughts.
Well, I guess, part of being a humanist is treasuring people and the things they do and looking at the world through trying to look at the world through their eyes. Empathy is very important and understanding, but I think as a humanist also, a very important message is that humanists generally believe that after they die, that's it. So a humanist is here, and the only thing they're going to leave behind is their life here. Therefore, in some sense, there's a stronger moral, ethical imperative for humanists to be pretty good and leave the world behind in a better place, because the only thing that's going to live after you is the memory that you leave in the minds of the people you leave behind. Maybe your genetic code too, but that's not much of a consolation in some ways. So humanism, I think, is tremendously important. My problem at the other side, the dark side of sort of religion for me, is in some sense there are so many different religions out there. There are so many different variations. There are so many different people who say, I've got the truth. I think everybody has some truth that works for them. There is some model inside their brain that gives their life meaning. But I believe it is firmly that thing is inside your brain. God is the product of man and not the other way around.
There's a story I just want to close with. It's a story about Karl Barth. And Karl Barth is one of probably the greatest theologians who lived in the past 100 years. And Karl Barth was coming outside, I'm not sure if it was outside of his office or church service, and there was an astronomer who actually came and met with him and said, Professor Barth, isn't it true that all religions are basically saying the same thing? And Karl Barth, who's studied and poured his entire life into deep theological questions, says, really, all of religion, all these different worlds are saying the same thing? What is this? The guy goes, well, do good unto others as you would have them do unto you. Isn't that the core of everything? And Karl Barth thought about this and he said, well, my friend, as an astronomer, isn't it true that all of astronomy can also be summarized into one phrase? And the astronomer is taken back. Galaxies and black holes and the curvature of space and time, all of these deep, complex ideas, there's a phrase that you can do this for? And he says, yes, isn't it just twinkle, twinkle, little star? How I wonder what you are. And so we can come up with these short catchphrases that summarize deep thought that people have wrestled with and say, you know what, all of that thing just goes in this box. But my friends, I encourage you now more than any time in your life, wrestle with the deep things.
Well, I think that both panelists will agree that this is the most fertile time in your life to really engage the big questions in your life. Who am I? What is my purpose? What does it all mean? How do I live an authentic life? And I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say how deeply grateful we are to both of you for your wisdom, your eloquence, your wit, your presentations, your conversation. So please join me in thanking our extraordinary panelists.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.